Because the first 12 chapters of Genesis, as we have said in previous podcasts, because those first 12 chapters of Genesis provide a knowledge and an understanding, has lessons contained that are just so critical for our Christian faith. It's important that we seek to understand the lessons chapter by chapter in Genesis 1 through Genesis 12, because those lessons help us understand who God is and who we are and what we are and the causes of sin and the curses of sin. And so I'm doing a series of podcasts going chapter by chapter. So without speaking about how we're going to interpret Genesis overall, how much is historical, how much is symbolic, how much is literal history, etc., without getting too deep into those debates, I just want to look at the lessons contained within that section of inspired Scripture to strengthen and build the Christian faith. So in this podcast, let's look really quickly at 4 of the main lessons that we see from the 5th chapter of the book of Genesis. And early in this chapter, it is restated that God intentionally made humans and that he made them or created them male and female. So God's already said in Genesis 1 that he created humans in his image, male and female. In Genesis 2, that talks a little bit more, gives a little bit more detail about how he created them, male and female, the fact that they were made to be helpmates, to provide support for one another as they do the work that God is calling them to do. And then here again in Genesis chapter 5, it is repeated that God has intentionally made human beings and he has created them male and female. And part of this is expressing again the wisdom of this design of having different genders that complement each other. And a huge part of the reason this is restated once again in the early portions of Genesis is to elevate the idea, to elevate God's design of the one man, one woman marriage relationship as the core institution, the first institution God ordained and the core institution that God has provided to both populate the earth and to structure societies within the earth. So governments and churches were also ordained by God, the 3 main institutions God has ordained: the family, the government, and the church. Governments and churches have huge roles to play in God's overall design. But one of the first things governments, churches, really any other civic or familial organization ought to do is strengthen the individual family. We cannot improve society without the family. And so everything in society should focus first on strengthening the one man, one woman family so that the foundations of our societies are stronger. A second thing that we get, and maybe one of the main things you see as you read through Genesis chapter 5, is all the lineages that are reported. This individual ultimately had this child, and they gave birth then to those grandchildren and so forth. And this is an important part of the biblical narrative. It shows, at least early on, that lineages were important to the Bible, to the design, to how God was going to validate his word. And we see this precision about dates and times. This person was this old when they had this child, and then they died when they were this old. And that person had that child when they were this old, and then they died when they were that old. And so one of the things that I think this is definitely doing is saying to us, these are literal historical individuals who really lived and they really had families, and these are the lineages of those families. And again, as we continue on closer and closer to Genesis 12, we'll begin to see how these lineages become very important, and it's used as a way for God to make his promises and to help us understand how and when those promises have been fulfilled. So we see the importance here of lineages, and we see the precision used in the wording here that helps us understand these are truly real historical figures. I think one of the lessons that we also get from Genesis 5, and we're going to see this in a couple of other chapters coming up, is that everything in Genesis is not always perfectly understandable to us, and that's okay. I think what we see sometimes is there may have been elements of what is written here in Genesis that made a great deal of sense to those to whom the passage was originally written. So Genesis was originally written by Moses for the Hebrew people, written by Moses 3,500-ish years ago, to the Hebrew people after they had literally just escaped centuries of bondage in a foreign land. So they had been exposed to a foreign culture. They had been exposed to foreign gods. They had been exposed to foreign creation stories. They had been told a different reason why they existed, where they came from, etc. And so Moses was writing this to the Hebrew people. We read it today, and there may be elements we read from it when they read Genesis 3:15, that the fruit of a woman would ultimately crush Satan's head, the serpent's head. They wouldn't have understood that that's Jesus of Nazareth that was being spoken of. We clearly see that connection today. And so I think some of the verses that we see in Scripture, for example, one is Genesis 5:24. Enoch walked with God, but was not, for God took him. That's difficult to understand. So this is what we would say. Apparently Enoch was a pretty righteous guy. He must have been one who sought after God. And then instead of him dying, as everybody else listed in that chapter did, instead of him dying and the age of his death being recorded, it just says he wasn't on the earth anymore because God took him. If there's more to that passage, I don't think we can understand it, and I don't think we should try to make more out of that passage than is there. It doesn't say everybody who seeks after God, everybody who finds favor with God will be taken up without dying. It doesn't say that. That would be stretching the text way too far. It doesn't give a particular reason that Enoch might have been and Noah might not have been taken up. So again, we don't want to try to read stuff into Scripture that's not there. It just simply says that Enoch was a good guy and that he walked with God, but he was not, for God took him. And so we just need to read that and say, apparently Enoch did not suffer a physical death. We know also, of course, later on, Elijah did not suffer a physical death, but was taken up in a whirlwind. But let's don't try to read more into passages than might be there, or think that we have to have a theological explanation in order to have a complete doctrine of our faith. Here's what I suspect is true. The readers, the original hearers of this Genesis chapter 5, as it was being read by Moses or Aaron or other folks down through time, they probably had a more full understanding of what that meant, and it probably was special to them in a way that just bypasses us today. And then finally, of course, the fourth main thing that we see from Genesis chapter 5 is the introduction of Noah and his family. And the Bible is so consistent in that. Nobody just shows up and then does. Jesus says, I didn't come to replace the old covenant. I came to fulfill it. Here's the verses that would explain to you how someone was going to come and fulfill it. It's so important. So we see in the Bible, there's always this foreshadowing. There's always God setting up, however slightly, however light the hint might be, or however dark or light the shadow might be. There's always this foreshadowing. There's always this setting up. There's always this preparation by God in His Word, getting us ready for what's coming next. And we see that in part in Genesis chapter 5, where we see Noah and his family come on to the scene. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this is Andy.